pleased that you're brave enough to come to a session called Can a Robot Do My Job? We'll be asking you what you do later, and the panel will be going, yes, it can, no, it can't. My name's Emily Bell. I'm the director of the Tow Centre for Digital Journalism at Columbia University in New York. And I'm really thrilled that we've got 4 fantastic exponents of what's being thought about and done at the cutting edge of automated journalism or artificial intelligence and journalism. And they're all going to, first of all, show you what they do. And then they'll be very happy to concretely answer the question, can a robot do your job? Starting right at the end, just a brief intro, starting right at the end of the row, we have Andreas Graef, who's actually a Tow Fellow, as are many of the others on the panel. I urge you to read Andreas's excellent Guide to Automated Journalism, which is a Tow Centre publication. I will tweet the link to that later so that you can read it, which, if you don't know what our panel are talking about, is a really fantastic primer. Next to Andreas, we have Justin Myers, who is the automation editor at the Associated Press. Next to Justin, we have Nick Diakopoulos, who is that rarest of things, a computational journalist. And Nick, also a Tow Fellow, is now at the University of Maryland, where you run, what's the name of your lab now, Nick? The Computational Journalism Lab. And then to my immediate right, another Tow Fellow who's doing some work for us at the moment on artificial intelligence and investigative reporting, but is also a colleague in the academic sense, in that she is an assistant professor at NYU, is Meredith Broussard. So as I say, what we're going to do is each of the panel are going to take a few minutes just to show you what they're working on and what they're thinking about. And then we will have a discussion prompted by that, and we'd like you all to be a very active part of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Andreas to kick us off, giving a sort of an overview of the field.
Thanks, Emily. So one area of my research is automated journalism. And I've heard people using this term over the past few days, meaning different things. What I mean is algorithms or software writing stories based upon data without any human intervention. So many people refer to this as robot journalism. When I say without human intervention, this means, of course, after the initial programming of the algorithm. Many people seem to forget that. So it's still a very human process. So everything the algorithm does has been predefined by humans. So which information goes in, how it's processed, and how it comes out. And then there's, of course, humans involved in maintaining the algorithms and refining them. But basically, the idea is that you have an algorithm, and once it's created, you can generate thousands of stories automatically on a particular topic. And I've written about this in the guide to automated journalism that Emily referred to. Can I have the slides? Thanks. And it's geared towards the target group of journalists, so it's an easy access to the topic. So I think it's a good starting point for you to jump off if you're interested in that topic. What I want you to get out of the 10 minutes is 4 things. I didn't know how much you know about this, so I kind of want to do some groundwork and explain the basic process of how this works. I want to briefly tell you the potentials and limitations of the technology, which then brings me to the conditions when it's actually useful, and I will then talk about why I think this will become more important. So how does it work? I want to explain this in very simple terms using an example from a project that we are currently working on, where we develop automated news based on forecasting data for this year's presidential election. So this is a project called the Polyvote.com, which has been founded in 2004. I have been working on it since 2007, and it's all about using evidence-based forecasting principles to predict elections. But if you want to tell a story about a forecast, let's say a poll, what you need to do is you need to collect data in the first place. and you need to collect it automatically. So the data needs to automatically feed into your system in order to trigger the generation of the text. And if you want to describe a poll, for example, of course you need polling data. So you need to know who conducted the poll, when it was conducted, who was surveyed, registered voters, likely voters, how many people were surveyed, what was the margin of error, and of course information on what's the actual preference of the people. Are they going to vote for Clinton or for Trump? When you have that kind of data, it's very easy to write a simple story about that poll. But maybe you want to make your story more interesting, and then for this you need to collect more data. So if, for example, if you have polling data over the course of the campaign, you could make comparisons of the polls, the recent polls to previous polls, let's say a month ago, a week ago, or whatever. You can add more data. You can have historical data on polls. Polls from previous elections, and you can have polls at the state level. And then you can make statements such as, I don't know, this is the largest lead of a Democratic candidate in the state of Florida in the April of an election year since 1996, when Clinton was running against Dole, for example. So the more data you have, the more possibilities and the more sophisticated your stories can become, but also the more complex it will be to actually define the algorithm. And this brings me to the second step, which is where it becomes rather challenging, where you actually define what you get out of the data. So you identify the interesting events. And this is very difficult. So for example, right now in the project, we are debating about, what's a momentum? Like, how would you describe whether a candidate has a momentum or not? It's very hard to come up with a specific rule based on data to identify that. You could say, for example, if a candidate gains support in the last 3 polls, but then again, this is one rule. Maybe it's not the right one. There's no expert consensus on that. Same for outlier poll. When is a poll an outlier? If it deviates from the polling average, yes, but by how much? And compared to the recent polling average or compared to the last week. So these are very difficult questions, and to keep people longer on their sites. And automation technology is valuable in doing that, in reaching new audiences. I've talked about this to Lou Ferrara at the AP. He's not there anymore, but he was responsible for the whole automation efforts. And he said, every media outlet will be under pressure to automate, and eventually everything that can be automated will be automated. And I leave it here and give it back to Emily.
Thanks very much indeed, Andreas. I'm pleased it was you, not me, who said that financial writing is generally speaking very poor. As a former business editor, I can neither confirm nor deny that is the case. But thanks very much indeed, Andreas. So moving on to Justin Myers from the AP. Justin, you're at the sort of sharp end of this, if you like, by actually putting these things into practice in the newsroom.
Just closing this. Yeah,
we can't get robots yet to program slideshows. There we go. Oh, it's for some reason not yet up on the. Have you got it on the screen?
Yeah, if I could get the slides, that would be great. So hi, I'm Justin, and I'm the news automation editor for the AP. Andreas had just mentioned Lou Ferrara, who used to be my boss's boss's boss. So there's certainly some relation there in terms of how the industry has proceeded. So people have paid a lot of attention to the AP recently because of our work in automation. But I have 3 things to tell you about this. First, this isn't only about articles. Articles certainly worry people the most, but I would certainly contend there's more variety than that. Second, this isn't only about the Associated Press or other news agencies. Newsrooms of all sizes are automating things. And finally, journalists still matter. Human editorial judgment is as important as ever. So what do I mean when I talk about automation? Because as Andreas mentioned, different people seem to have different definitions of these things. I do include what he mentioned and what most of you are thinking of in terms of generating and publishing content. But I also include things like bots that help with reporting and research tasks, as well as those that help with production, like deciding what to publish or how and when to publish it. I tend to think of this in terms of a range of automation, going all the way from internal projects that are only seen to people within the newsroom, over to external projects that publish directly to readers and customers. So with that out of the way, here's what I plan to talk about in the next few minutes. First, I want to introduce myself briefly, because while I try to be visible in the American journalism community, I realize there might be a lot more questions from a European audience about who exactly this automation editor person is. Second, mainly, I plan to show some examples of automation, both from my own newsroom as well as others. And finally, I want to touch briefly on some of the philosophies I think about when I'm working on automation projects. So first, a little about me. I've been at the AP just over a year. I started last March. And I'm a journalist first and foremost. I studied journalism at the University of Missouri, and there I focused on newspaper design and copy editing. Since then, I've worked in a couple of national media outlets in the United States, both on interactive graphics and on data journalism projects. And at the AP, I'm continuing with data journalism projects, and I'm part of the 11-person data journalism team there. So with that out of the way, let's talk about some examples of automation in newsrooms. First, of course, are articles. Those are probably the reason you're all here. They're definitely on the external end of the spectrum that I mentioned earlier. And that can include things like reports on companies' earnings, like we do at the AP. They could be summaries of sporting events. We're working on that at the AP. I don't have an example I'm allowed to show you publicly yet. And they can be about natural disasters, such as the earthquake stories that are automatically written at the Los Angeles Times. So in general, these are meant to be ready to publish. Sometimes they even publish automatically. Our earnings reports, for example, publish automatically. But as Andreas mentioned, they're most useful for high-volume stories, highly repetitive stories, really the kinds of articles that tend to look very similar to one another. My next example is graphics. These are still about finished content that readers eventually see, so again, they're on the external end of this range. This includes print graphics, such as the stock market charts that we publish every day at the AP. So these get generated automatically after the markets close. But I would extend my definition of automation to include interactives, such as the results maps that we've been producing for all of the nominating contests for the presidential race in the US. Again, they're ready to publish, or they publish themselves, especially in the context of interactives that update themselves over time. It also seems like people tend to worry less about this sort of automation. And I feel like that could be because graphics designers and interactives developers might be more likely to see technology in general as a tool rather than as a threat. My next examples are bots that interact with users of social media. We just finished a large basketball tournament in the United States, and one of the public radio stations in New York made Nailbiter Bot on Twitter, which just tells users about games that are about to end and have close scores. So if you're only sort of paying attention, you can just catch up with what's interesting. These types of bots can end up leading to whole new story forms of their own. And they're especially popular outside of journalism proper. So sometimes that's as advocacy and sometimes as art. But because users interact directly with these bots, it can be difficult as a news organization to get users to associate these bots with your brand. Now for something that's not quite as public, automated systems that help people in newsrooms with frequent production tasks, such as copying things from one system to another or promoting pieces of content. Or in this room yesterday, there was talk about verification of user-generated content, which I would also put in this category. One example is Blossom at the New York Times, which helps suggest content that would do well on various social media platforms. The Los Angeles Times also built a system to assemble its daily feature for its website about major pieces of content that ran in the print edition. So these kinds of tasks might create things that are ready to be published, but they also might not. They also tend to help with things that are tedious or that involve working with and synthesizing large amounts of information. And generally, the idea is to augment producers' capabilities in their newsrooms. And my last examples are those that help reporters directly. These certainly aren't meant to be seen by readers, so they're on the internal end of my range. For example, I've written about a number of email alerts at the AP. This example is about a healthcare provider that got hacked and 1,000 patients' information got compromised. And so these kinds of alerts work on government data and go out to any interested people on staff. That could include our healthcare reporters or our investigative reporters, but it can also include editors in the areas where these companies are located. I also have some alerts this year around the presidential election, because our politics reporters get a lot of information on a daily basis. In this case, about where candidates are or aren't spending their money on television ads. So again, these are not meant to be published directly. They're more as tips for reporters, mainly in order to help them manage large amounts of data. And as with the production tasks I mentioned earlier, they're really about augmenting capabilities of humans in the newsroom. So there's a lot of variety in automation, at least as I see it. So how do we manage this? I think mainly computers and people have fundamentally different strengths. I think computers can be really helpful at telling what has happened, but I think people are much better at explaining why it has happened and putting that information in context for a reader. And so where I see the promise of automation is giving reporters more time to focus on why, because they don't have to be as preoccupied with what. But there's this inherent issue with automation in newsrooms, and you heard a little bit about this in the previous presentation, and that's whether you do something manually or automatically, you're still making the exact same editorial decisions. So for example, why is this earthquake worth covering? Or why is this basketball game interesting enough to warn people about? Or if I'm writing an earnings report, why do I decide to call this change small versus large? And the tricky part about automation is, yes, you're making those decisions, but you're making them ahead of time. You're making them when that algorithm is defined, which could be months or years in advance. Where this gets dangerous is sometimes these decisions are made by people who are not journalists. And so they might pick something that's technically convenient, but they might not consider the nuance of the issue in the same way that a trained journalist would. And so if you do have somebody else build these systems, I think you have to keep your journalists involved in order to make sure that they meet your newsroom standards. And Nick's work on algorithmic accountability is pretty closely connected to this issue, and you'll hear from him in a few minutes, I think. And thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. Thanks, Justin. Who here gets, does anyone here get news delivered by a bot at the moment? Okay, about half the room. I get my news every morning through Messenger, and I only like it because it has like a robot face and wavy hands, which says something about automation. Meredith, you next.
Hi, everybody. So I have kind of an unusual background. I started my career as a computer scientist, and then I quit to become a journalist. And now I teach data journalism at NYU. And primarily my research is about artificial intelligence for investigative reporting. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Can we get the slides up? All right, thank you. So usually when I say artificial intelligence, this is what people think. And there's something important to remember here, which is that this is imaginary. All right, so is HAL 5000, like all of these things, they're science fiction. What we have is we have to stay in the realm of reality. And in reality, we have code, we have data, we have algorithms, and we have people. That's it. So we don't have sentient beings that exist in the machine. There is no ghost in the machine. It's just people, it's rules, it's data, it's code, it's algorithms. It all comes down to math. Okay? And another thing that's real is that coming up with original ideas as a reporter is really hard. So this is one of the hardest things that we do as reporters, is come up with original ideas for investigative stories, especially high impact investigative stories. So it's very easy to come up with a mundane idea, and it's very easy to come up with an unoriginal idea. But coming up with an original idea, most of us don't do it all that often. And this is actually something that reporters are really good at. Reporters are really good at coming up with original ideas on deadline. So what I do, what I'm working on right now, is I'm working on building something that I call the Story Discovery Engine, which is an artificial intelligence tool for helping reporters to quickly and efficiently generate new investigative story ideas using public affairs data. So the way it works is that it works by comparing what should be to what is. All right, so what should be is articulated in laws and policy, and what is articulated in data. So if you look at what should be, and then you look at the data to find out what is actually going on, you're going to find a bunch of anomalies. And every time you see an anomaly, you have an opportunity for a story. And so as reporters, we're really used to this workflow, right? We're really accustomed to looking at something and saying, that's weird, I wonder what's going on. And that leads us down a rabbit hole. And those rabbit holes can be really fascinating, and those rabbit holes can lead to high impact investigative story ideas. Now, I will also say that the difficulty of coming up with these types of enterprise story ideas is related to the frequency of the production of these types of enterprise story ideas, which is that it's really hard to come up with these ideas, so we don't do it that often. So many investigative story ideas are reactive. They come from a tip from a whistleblower, as opposed to being proactive, coming from the reporter themselves. So the Story Discovery Engine is a way of helping the reporter become proactive about discovering new ideas. So it derives from a kind of artificial intelligence concept called an expert system that originated around the 1960s. And the idea was that you would make this machine, this black box, and hopefully Nick is going to talk a little bit more about black boxes. And so the idea was you'd have this box, and the box would function like a human expert, and you would consult it for advice. So you would have a lawyer in a box or a doctor in a box, and you would be able to ask it, is this rash? Does this rash look contagious? Or, something like that. Or am I going to get sued if I, steal this money from this person? And the box would give you advice. But the problem is it never worked. All right, so human expertise is too complex to be represented using any existing computational methods. So the expert system fell totally out of favor in the 1990s. But what I did was I resurrected it, and I hacked the idea. I said, all right, I don't actually need the system to make decisions for me. What I need it to do is I need it to look at an unbelievably complex mass of data, an unbelievably complex mass of rules, and I need it to make a visualization for me so that I can understand the situation a little bit better and I can sniff out a story idea. So let me show you an image of what this looks like. So on the top, we've got the original expert system. So we've got a non-expert user over on the left, and that non-expert user would query the interface, and they would so go in the user interface. There's a thing called an inference engine. There's this knowledge base, and the knowledge from the expert would be encoded in the knowledge base. It would run through the inference engine, and then it would show up to the user. But again, this never worked very well. So what I did was I took this idea and changed it a little bit. So that's what you see on the in the bottom image. So you've got your reporter, and your reporter gets out from the system a data visualization that helps them get closer to a story idea. So we've still got the inference engine, we've still got the knowledge base, and then you can see there is localized, in this case, education data. So what I did in the prototype, the first prototype I did for this method was I built a system to help me do investigative reporting on public education in Philadelphia. And so I took the expertise of an experienced education reporter. I took localized education data. I took the knowledge base, okay, so the rules, the laws, and policies about what is supposed to be in education. I coupled it with the data about what is in education. I ran it through the software, and then it would output a visualization that would get me to a story idea. So here's an example of what it looks like in practice. I built a reporting tool, and then I used the reporting tool in order to write a bunch of stories. So you can check this out online if you want. It's online at stackedup.org. So you see here, we've got a reporting tool. I decided that if I was building this reporting tool for myself, I might as well publish it online and let other people use it as well, because there are a lot of potential stories to be written, and I wasn't going to be able to get to all of them. So there's the reporting tool, and then you have this column of stories based on the reporting tool. And here's inside. So we have a view of, so the big idea behind the story was, do Philadelphia schools have enough books? Ordinarily, we think about school success as being related to socioeconomic factors, are parents reading to their children, that kind of thing. But I discovered that there was this practical consideration, which was that the students didn't have enough books. And the books had the material that's on the tests. Like, that's it. It's as simple as that. If you want to pass the tests, you need to read these books that have the material that is replicated almost exactly on the tests. So it shows you all the books and all the schools, then it shows you a visualization of a single school. Just to give you an idea of the scope of this, there are approximately 250 schools inside the Philadelphia School District, and each school has 4 to 12 grades, and each grade has multiple classes. Let's say it has 25 classes. So you actually can't do this calculation in your head, and you can't do this calculation with any existing software. So I built the software, and then I realized, oh, the software is generalizable. This is a generalizable idea about investigative reporting. So you can go in and you can look inside the book closet of any school in Philadelphia and determine, do these students seem to have enough books, and if not, why? And the why is really interesting, right? Because the why is different every single time. Does anybody do reporting on schools? No? Okay. Well, one of the things you learn as an education reporter is that things are messed up in public education in it's predictable that things are messed up, but the way that they're messed up is unpredictable and always fascinating. So this also resulted in a big story in the Atlantic that launched that contributed to a national conversation about what do we value in education. So the thing I'm doing next is I'm taking this idea, and as a Tao Fellow, I am working on making a news story discovery engine to uncover campaign finance fraud in the US. So we know that there is fraud in campaign finance. We don't know how much, and we know a couple predictable ways that people are committing fraud, but we don't know who, and we don't know how, and we don't know why. So what the Story Discovery Engine is doing is it's taking the laws about campaign finance, and it's taking the data about about what is in campaign finance, and it's putting them together. And every time there's an anomaly, that's an opportunity for a story. All right, so thank you. That's all I got.
Meredith, that's great. Thank you very much. And Nick, fine, over to you for our last.
All right. So I guess I'm the last one on the panel to go here. Can we get the slides, please? Right, so I'm Nick Diakopoulos. I'm at the University of Maryland and also a TAL fellow. And just to kind of get this up front, no, a robot is not, cannot do your job. But I'm going to try to tell you about some of the ways that it can and will change your job. And this may or may not be surprising, but algorithms and automation and bots are sort of around us everywhere now, in industry and government, in the media systems that we're part of. Algorithms are targeting people in political communications. They're helping with urban planning. They're used as inputs into criminal sentencing decisions in the United States. And of course, they're everywhere in the media. Search rankings, personalization, recommendations, curation and commenting systems and moderation and so on. I like this cartoon because it kind of puts its finger on a very astute point here. You have this woman kind of looking annoyedly back at this guy saying, I'd like to meet the algorithm that thought we'd be a good match. And so, of course, you have algorithms happening throughout industry and government and in areas of our life like romancing and matchmaking. But we don't necessarily have a very good view into how those algorithms are informing the kinds of decisions that they're informing. But maybe we should. Maybe we should start scrutinizing these systems and trying to understand them a little bit more carefully. So this is where the idea of algorithmic accountability comes in. And I also have a TAO report that came out a couple of years ago on this. I would encourage you to go online and Google for it. The idea is really about thinking through the methods for how we can investigate algorithms in media and industry and government, and trying to understand how we can characterize the bias, the power, the influence of those algorithms in various ways, and of course thinking about the role that journalists should play in that process. So as the sort of traditional people who are holding the powerful institutions in society accountable, algorithms are a somewhat newish form of power that's being exerted, and we need to sort of understand that power. So to the extent that there's more automation, more algorithms, more robots being used everywhere around us, investigative journalism, I think there's a huge opportunity here for creating kind of a new beat. So this is the idea that the job is going to change a little bit, right? There's going to be new ways of covering these types of computational systems. There's a new beat, and that, I think, bodes well for the growth of human-based journalism, provided that we can find the financial support and the means to keep that going. So let me give you an example of an algorithmic accountability story that I've been working on in my lab at the University of Maryland, sort of getting interested in this little search box here, the Google search engine, and thinking about the ways in which search engines mediate information around political candidates and controversial issues online. So there was actually, I think, a fairly important study that was published late last year in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that showed this effect called the search engine manipulation effect. And what they did was a series of experiments with thousands of participants where they showed that if you show someone search rankings that are highly biased toward one candidate at the top of those rankings, that you could get people to vote for that candidate, that you would influence their predilection to vote for that candidate. And moreover, in the sequence of experiments that were run, the researchers showed that you could actually mask this effect, that you could people wouldn't even notice that they were looking at these biased results. So that, I think, is a really important result that points to the power of algorithms in democratic systems. And so those experiments were done with a kind of a laboratory-based search engine that they built specially for studying that. I'm interested in seeing what kind of effects we can see in the real world on a search engine like Google. And so we got into starting to collect data around different political candidates in the US. We have an election coming up this year. We gathered some of this data late last year in December of 2015 to try to understand whether or not some results were more supportive of a candidate when you search for that candidate, or whether or not those results were more oppositional. And what we did was we came up with what we're calling a favorability score, which is kind of a crowdsourced score that looks at how favorable or oppositional a particular result is on the results page for a particular candidate. And we searched for all the Republican candidates and for all the Democratic candidates. And what you're seeing in this graph is an aggregation of those scores. In blue, you can see the Democratic candidates, and in red, the Republican candidates. And the basic difference is that the Democratic candidates, the results for Democrats are substantially more favorable to that candidate than the Republican results. And the result rank goes from the top result down to the bottom of the first page, so to the 10th result. And you can also see this trend where the very top results are quite favorable to the candidate, and then it kind of gets less favorable as you move down the page. Toward the bottom of the page is where you tend to see critical news articles popping up, and at the top of the page is where you have the sort of campaign-controlled information, the social media feeds, the Facebook page and all that kind of stuff. So if we look at this in a slightly different way, this is a breakdown at the top of Republicans and at the bottom of Democrats. You can see there's a lot more orange at the top, which is indicating more con and very con results. And there's more purple at the bottom for the Democrats that's indicating more pro and very pro. And you might even see that Bernie Sanders, who's the second up from the bottom, has no con results. In fact, he's all purple. He's all dark purple, very pro. That means the search engine is just showing positive information about Bernie Sanders when you search for his name. So this is just the start of this investigation, but sort of to give you a flavor of how this plays out, we're collecting data, we're seeing how that data kind of reflects biases in that system, and then reasoning about what the potential implications of those biases would be. So now I want to kind of switch it up and talk a little bit about how the use of algorithms, another way in which the use of algorithms is going to change the job of journalists, which is that in the same way that algorithms and bots and automation are being used in all these other facets of society, news organizations are also adopting these same technologies. They're creating automated news reports, as we've heard. They're using automation for the curation of content, for recommendation systems, to help curate comments, for instance. And they're also using simulations and modeling to help tell stories. So kind of at the very front end, you see this happening a lot with the New York Times graphics team, where you can actually tweak and tune a model and it will visualize that model. So about a year ago, we convened about 50 people at the Tao Center at Columbia to talk through these different case studies, these 3 case studies, and try to understand, as we start to adopt these technologies, how can we actually be transparent about them so that we don't turn into part of the problem where we're kind of black boxing everything, but where we need to think through how we can be transparent to develop trust and maintain the relationship with our publics. So we were asking questions like, what could we even make public about the algorithms we're using in a newsroom? And what would the limits of algorithmic transparency be in terms of media accountability? What would a comprehensive disclosure mechanism look like? What are the different models? Do we want to put transparency information in the interface, or does there need to be an on-board person or some other algorithmic transparency report that's published? These were all kinds of things that came up. And so we had all these discussions and these case studies going on and transcribed all that information and have been kind of analyzing it to come up with an initial model of what could become a transparency standard for journalists using algorithms in the newsroom. So you can sort of see this broken down across different layers. the data layer, the model layer, the inference layer, and the interface layer. And of course, there's many different sub-pieces to each of these layers that were discussed in these case studies as being disclosable pieces of information that we could show the public. And you'll also see that human involvement is kind of the overarching factor here. Humans are sort of involved at every layer of the design and development and even implementation of these systems. It's I think, rare to find a completely fully automated system. Even if the entire article is written automatically, sometimes there's still a person who has to read it before they press the publish button, or there'll be someone coming in after there was a mistake or an error and trying to debug it and figure out how to change the model so it doesn't make that mistake again. So there's almost always a continual sort of human presence in these systems. So we're trying to sort of eat our own dog fooding it by applying this model of algorithmic transparency to our own projects. So this is actually another algorithmic accountability story that we published in the Washington Post a few weeks ago, where we were looking at Uber surge pricing in the Washington, D.C. area and seeing how that relates to demographic characteristics like race. And so we put our entire analysis and all of the data, all of the code that can be used to reproduce that analysis, but also repeat that analysis. So if you want to go collect data and do an analysis like this for your own city, you can grab our code and use it to launch that investigation. We're also doing this for bots that we're creating. We have a bot called Anecbottle NYT. It's a comment bot. It's a Twitter bot which sort of tries to highlight and find interesting anecdotal comments with anecdotes in them from the New York Times site, and then bring them into Twitter conversations and get people to kind of recognize that there's interesting stories out there about the stories that they're reading. And again, we're kind of eating our own dog food, thinking through the editorial transparency of this kind of bot, and writing up, across the different facets of data and model and interface, thinking through what we should disclose about how this bot is working and what the editorial rules are, and so on. So that's about what I have. You're certainly welcome to get in touch. Some of the studies that I've referenced are there for you, and you can find them on my website, or you can go to the GitHub page to see these other projects and the code and the data behind them. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Nick, and all the panelists. I did notice, incidentally, that you said no, a robot is not going to take your job. So you've all slightly dodged the central issue very cleverly. But particularly for those who are not working in newsrooms and therefore not casting their colleagues out onto the streets, that there must be, you've all described amazing ways in which automation can enhance and extend what we do or make it better. When you work with journalists or you look at how newsrooms are configured, where do you think the missed opportunities are to kind of put that labour into something useful where currently it's perhaps devoted to other tasks? Well, one thing that interests me is something that Justin says about internal tasks, right? So CMS tasks or production tasks. I'm not asking you to put a number on it, but I'm saying, with your knowledge of computer science, what would you expect? Where would you expect the most progress to be made in terms of getting those kind of tasks out of the hands of humans? He says, putting it diplomatically.
Well, I came up with the idea of automating the production of story ideas because I used to be an editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer. And I saw a lot of ways that we could use automation to make things easier for reporters, but it kind of drove me crazy when we didn't. So I came up with some of my current research just as a result of wanting to put in more automation in newsrooms so that reporters' lives would be easier. So what Justin said about automating routine production tasks, really resonated for me because there's a lot of boring stuff that we do as reporters. There's a lot of routine things that we do as reporters, and those are great targets for automation. so that reporters and production people can be freed up to do more interesting high-level things. So if you just have like a really good way of transferring information from one system to the other, for example, so that you don't have to do that manually, like that's going to save you so much time. Like, have you ever needed to like take something from the print CMS and put it into the web CMS, and it was just a hassle, and you had to spend 5 minutes trying to make this thing work? Like, think about all those 5 minutes that you've lost over the course of the past 15 years and add those all up. Like, that's a really great opportunity for automation, so that you get that 5 minutes back and you actually save a little bit more time so that you can do more reporting.
So I would just jump in. I mean, this is kind of already covered, I think, in Andreas' talk, but I think anywhere you find scale happening, or where the business model is based on scale, I think you're going to find areas where you can use automation to sort of work at scale and disseminate at scale or produce at scale. I mean, we're all kind of coping with social media and the volume there now, and I think that's an area where there is some automation in terms of social listening, for instance, to try to surface interesting, newsworthy types of things going on, or detect events and alert journalists to what's going on with those. So I think we maybe will see more of that and automation in that area. But also curation on site, so commenting systems where you have, routinely 5,000, 6,000 comments on an article, and you really need help as a moderator kind of sifting through that to identify what's good, what's bad, and what should kind of float to the top.
Justin, are newsrooms in general, from your experience, resourcing this properly? It's an open goal to ask somebody who's working on this, say, no, I need more resources. But, it seems to me that given that Facebook has 700 engineers working on artificial intelligence, I mean, I know they're Facebook, right, and we're talking about much smaller news organizations, but what would you say about the sort of the general balance of resource internally around this in newsrooms?
I would say on one hand, we can always use more resources for these things, and you sort of hinted that I would say that. I think I would love to see more people doing this kind of work, but I think part of that is that newsrooms, and especially the people making budgeting and staffing decisions in newsrooms, aren't aware of those possibilities. You can't get them to hire somebody for a solution when they don't even realize that solution is a thing that they could do. And so I think really increasing awareness within organizations, increasing awareness within the industry is going to be critical to getting any more resources, let alone enough to do all of the stuff that we could possibly be tasked with.
Andreas, I wanted to sort of just follow up on that a little bit, because when I was looking at your work and the things that you're experimenting with now, it seems also that there's like I hate to raise this because it feels like it's an opportunity for some genuinely awful journalism, but it feels as though we ought to be maybe also looking at kind of predictive journalism as well. So you were talking about, we've talked about data can tell you when something has happened, but it also tells you when something will happen. And it feels as though that's an interesting area that's being explored in models, but not necessarily applied back into the newsroom sort of routinely.
Well, yeah, I think that the project that we are working on, what's interesting about this, it's using automation for an area where there is lots of uncertainty, and it's a sensitive topic. So the elections in the US are, people get very emotional about it. Our fan base usually changes depending on who we predict to win the election. This has been the case since 2004. So I think it's really a first case where algorithmic transparency actually is very important, because people will want to know, what's behind. Why is this article generated this way? What's the data? And I think it will be interesting, and this is part of what we're going to do. We're going to do user studies on how these texts are actually perceived in terms of journalistic quality.
I'm going to open it up to questions now. So if you put your hands up, I think there is a roving mic. So if we start We've got a couple of questions there, and I think then maybe somebody's just over behind you and one behind there. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, fascinating discussion. I'm Gavin Rees. I work for the Dart Centre for Journalism and Trauma. It strikes me that in the presentation of developing an algorithm to spot bias, then there's obviously the question of who's going to watch your algorithm. And I was trying to work out and guess maybe why the Republicans seem to come off so badly. And if the algorithm is looking for intemperate speech, considering most of the Republican candidates seem to spend a lot of their time slagging each other off, and that's a marker of negativity, then maybe those stories will kind of flag up. So that's the first question, is that what was happening there? A follow-on question from that is, what role might algorithms play in flagging up trolls and abusive commenting, and how far are we in developing systems that makes it faster to try and work out whether online discussion is being hijacked by particular interests?
So to the first part of your question, why are Republicans more negative? It gets exactly to Justin's point about what algorithms are good at and what people are good at. Answering the why of that question is really, really hard. We only have observational data. And so it's very difficult to understand what are the constellation of factors that are feeding into that. We can try to reason about it. What we wrote in our article is that the news articles that come up in the rankings around candidates tend to be the pages that are more negative. And so one of the follow-on directions that we're going is actually looking at what's the baseline of media bias around candidates in Google News. So if you know the baseline of how positive or negative the news is, then you know, like, what is the world of news that Google knows about, and is that world being represented in the top 10 links that it's showing you in an equivalent proportion? Your second question was about moderation and identifying trolls. There's a lot of really good research coming out in the last couple of years, including some of my papers, but also people at Stanford and UT Austin and other places where we're developing kind of data science methods for identifying not only like the bad stuff that's going on, but also identifying the really good stuff, which I think are somewhat different problems, but both important. And so has it been integrated into products and tools yet? No, but I know, for instance, the Coral Project, where I'm in touch with the Coral Project, and I hope to kind of get some of those ideas transitioned into real systems that can be used.
Do people here generally, does everybody know what the Coral Project is? Does anyone not know what the Coral Project is? You don't know what the Coral, just very briefly, do you want to explain what it is, Nick?
Yeah, sure. So the Coral Project is an effort funded by the Knight Foundation and coordinating efforts from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Mozilla to sort of develop new tools for community organization, including online comments, and kind of operating in a very data-driven way to measure things like activity and behavior and expertise and things like that.
Thanks.
I believe they're here, actually. The Coral Project folks are doing a talk tomorrow about their community moderation tools that they're building.
Yeah, so plug for Coral. There you go. You're welcome.
Terrific. Yeah, there's another question there.
Hi, I'm not a journalist. I'm a technologist, so I'm not scared by artificial intelligence. I'm fascinated by it, and by the way, great talks. I would like to follow up on what Andrea said about artificial intelligence not being able to be creative. I don't know how sure are we of this, and if it's not wishful thinking as a species, thinking that artificial intelligence cannot be creative. I would like to point to 3 examples. You're probably aware of what happened with Tammy, the robot, the chatbot by Microsoft that developed her own personality on Twitter. Unfortunately, it was a racist Nazi personality, but yeah. she was definitely creative and human-like enough to be offensive. There is a second example, not so well known, but if you follow Medium, there is an account on Medium which is called Fully Fueled. It's a bot. It writes and reads and answers to you. And I've been following for a while, and it's getting better and better and more human-like, and it definitely has a voice of its own. And the third example is what happened recently. You're for sure aware of that, with this Go game. For those of you who don't know, Go is a game which is chess multiplied by, like, I don't know, hundreds of millions of complexity, so you cannot brute force it. You can only win by being human-like creative. And I was following, when the game was happening, the comments on Reddit and in Hacker News, and experts at Go were saying, wow, nobody teaches you to play that way. And people were starting to use the word superhuman. So it got creative in the way it beat the human. I don't know if you're like 100% sure that artificial intelligence cannot be creative, and how long is it going to take until it is, because I believe it's inevitable.
Great question. Andreas.
Go ahead.
I think your examples show that we don't have to wait at all. It's already there. It's just a matter of is it creative in the kinds of ways that we expect AI to need to be creative in order to produce good journalism. So finding the story that no one else would find, or creating a connection between two non-obvious things, that kind of thing, in order to uncover it. But I'm certainly not sure that AI can't be creative. I think it can. I think we've seen AI art types of things that you could maybe make an argument are creative in different ways, or have emergent behavior. And so I'm not willing to put a conjecture on how long it's going to take to hit journalism, but I think that it will.
Well, let me also say that
go ahead.
it depends on kind of how you define creativity, and also what you want. Like, if you want to believe that a computer can think, then you're going to read it very differently than if you don't want to believe that a computer can think. So it depends on whether we're talking about creativity as an act of developing something original, or we're talking about creativity as an act of a sentient being. And computers are not sentient. Like, they're just not. Like, can a non-sentient thing produce something original? Yes. But does it mean anything? Like, arguably all of these examples are deterministic processes. Like, you can figure out how exactly what were the steps involved in getting there, and none of them required humanity, they just required strategic decision making.
But I would push back on that and say that, I mean, sure, expert systems are kind of, you can quantify the rules, but there's so much machine learning going on where really it's learning, a set of associations from data. So it's not a recipe, it's a recipe for learning recipes, right? And I think that sets the world up in a very different way, and makes it a lot more difficult to understand how it learned that new set of recipes that it learned.
Sure, I guess I'll go to Meredith's definition point, and I would argue emergence isn't creativity. I think even in Nick's case of, rules for determining rules, that is still a rules-driven system. You might not understand the rules. You might have to do some reverse engineering to try and get at what those rules might be. If you're in a newsroom implementing things like I am, you might even rule out entire types of systems because you can't explain them well enough when those questions come up. But I wouldn't consider emergent behavior to be the same as creativity.
If I may comment on that, you just said that because we cannot understand it well enough, it doesn't mean that it's creative, but the human mind works the same way. At the end, the human mind can be breaking down into neurons, firing hormones and things like that. So you just said something like to put let's say the threshold where the creativity is connecting seemingly unrelated stories. I wanted to talk about the fourth case, but it was too nerdy, but now I'm going to bring it up. There was recently a case where machine learning, deep learning, started analyzing tumors, the cells in a tumor, to predict the survival rate. And suddenly, the algorithm started outperforming humans, and they realized that it was not looking at the cells of the tumor, it was looking at the cells around it, the cells that were still healthy. And that's something that nobody thought of. Me personally, if a human says, hey, let's check what happens if we look at the cells which are not yet in the tumor, I believe that's creativity. The fact that it's done by a deterministic system or not, I'm not sure where to put the line.
Well, I think there are good definitions for creativity. I'm not prepared to spout one off right now, but there are entire books that are written on that. And so I think depending on your definition of creativity, you could say that that is or isn't in the same line that Meredith, I think, was saying. So.
Could I just be sort of slightly controversial and in a way sort of back up what you were saying? But one of the things which is a challenge for journalism is that a lot of what we do is actually not very creative, and it's very deliberately bounded by rules. So arguably, if you fed the AP style book to the right machine, it would be, is there going to be, is one of the ways that journalists maintain their jobs to be, as it were, less bound by the kinds of rules or the institutional rules we've had for formatting processes and output, because often that's the stuff that can be replicated by a bot, right? Possibly, don't know.
Well, the AP style checker, I will say, is pretty fantastic. There are these tools that you can use and they're particularly useful for teaching journalism classes. So you get these student stories and you always have to check them for AP style, but it becomes very, very tedious to check hundreds of student stories for AP style.
That's an opportunity for a robot, if ever there was one.
So there's this online thing that checks a thing for correctness or for adherence to AP style, which is a great use of automated technology for something that I am pretty excited to save a few minutes on, style checking stories.
More questions? There were a couple of hands up. One over there. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Livia. I was in a talk earlier today where they were also discussing social algorithms and the power of them to sort of influence public behavior around what we wear, what we eat, and it was suggested that it could actually, that it was possible that there would be legislation in the future that would actually force companies like Facebook to reveal their algorithms to the public. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Does anyone want to take that?
I think it's a noble goal. I think from the history of, mandated disclosure in consumer products and in business dealings in particular, I think if that were to actually be implemented, it would be way too easy to game that system and disclose enough to say that, oh, we told you what it's doing, but not enough to actually be useful.
So I think there's different regulation models here that you could kind of look to for guidance. So in the US, we have targeted transparency policies in certain areas where, like for instance, if you're going to sell a new automobile, you have to do a series of safety tests, right? And the same exists for other types of devices, like medical devices that have kind of a life-death consequence to them. So there is regulation. There's a precedent for regulation of devices which include algorithms and software in them. I think for us, it's sort of a matter of figuring out what are the instances in the algorithmic media where that type of intervention is warranted. I think that the study that showed that search rankings can influence voting kind of preferences, or another study that showed that the Facebook newsfeed can influence whether or not someone even goes out and votes, that's kind of getting closer to that line where, as a society, we should really start asking questions of maybe we want to get some regulators in there. It might not be at the level of sort of a strictly codified, you must do this, you must do that. It might be more of a, you have a third party, which maybe isn't even a government agency, but is kind of a trusted third party that has access to interview and examine code and examine data and benchmark the types of biases that are present in those systems.
And I think that Nick's work on algorithmic accountability is a good way of thinking about how do we talk about algorithms, because it's actually extraordinarily difficult to talk about algorithms in public spheres, because we all have different amounts of comfort with talking about technology, different amounts of experience with code, and so it's a pretty big challenge to say, all right, what do we need to make available? What do we need to make transparent about this algorithm when you're not really sure how much people understand about what an algorithm is in the first place. And you've got the people who don't understand algorithms at all, and then you've got the people who can write the mathematical proofs for, is an algorithm valid? And that's a really wide range of people. So it's a really big vocabulary challenge. What are the words we use to talk about algorithms? And how do we do that without boring the pants off of people? That's a big challenge for journalism as well. Like, we do not want to be boring.
Good points. Now, any more questions? I'm not going to make the session run to time because I am aware that we are in the hottest room in the entire journalism festival, as somebody pointed out to me, so there may be the energy levels sag. But I do want to ask the panel what, to each think of something sort of in the, not the near future, but maybe the far future, which they think would be exciting to see in newsrooms and that would be possible. So we could argue about sort of, how creative or uncreative bots might be. If anyone else has got a question in the meantime, put your hands up. But Nick is looking like he's already thought of something that's exciting and creative.
Exciting, yes. Okay, so here we go. The CIA, basically, IARPA, is the government agency that funds CIA-related research in the US. And they have a project called Ember, which has been running for about 4 years now, so it's not exactly new. And what Ember does is it listens to everything that's public on the internet. It scrapes it, it analyzes it, and it's able to predict events like riots and protests, civil unrest, like with a strikingly good accuracy level. They can also predict things like disease outbreaks. So it's running. I'm quite certain the CIA is using it. But how could journalists and newsrooms use a similar type of approach to predicting events? And how would that change how you deploy resources in a newsroom? If you're like 90% sure that there's going to be a protest in a certain city tomorrow, do you put a reporter on the plane the night before to make sure they're there? And then there's interesting questions about the feedback loop. If you're pretty sure something's going to happen and you report on it before it happens, have you all of a sudden induced it to happen or participated in creating the event yourself? So I think there's really interesting questions that type of technology raises.
Sorry, can we put you on mic just so that they can hear you they can't hear you on the stream otherwise, so that's all right.
Well, okay, we're looking at this from a journalistic perspective, but when you say we can make things predictable, right? It might be nice, like, to know whether there's going to be happening, I don't know, anything very bad, but if you're like of a very from a not very open society, you can misuse that as well. So where do we end up if, like, we can use that as journalists, but if, for example, Russia or China or any government which is not really in favor of protests or something like this, where's the free internet? I don't know, maybe, I don't want to play the bad advocate, but what do you think about that?
There's some really interesting work coming out of the University of Washington. Phil Howard and Sam Woolley are doing some really interesting work on political bots and how are governments using political bots to drown out free speech on the internet. Actually, there was that article in Bloomberg the other day about the guy in Mexico who was launching cyber attacks in favor of one candidate, which was a pretty fascinating story. There's definitely the possibility of drowning out free speech and using bots and using automation to suppress free dialogue.
I think the cat's out of the bag. China is already listening to signals and figuring out where there's going to be a protest before it happens. So I think you can't stop technology, you just have to deal with it, and it's up to us to kind of figure out, how do we react to that, and how do we reorient, and how can we subvert that or push back, and those kinds of things.
And one way of pushing back is by writing our own algorithms. So, we can investigate the algorithms that are written by people in positions of power, but we can also write our own algorithms to expose biases in those algorithms that are making decisions on our behalf.
Justin, did you? Yes. you
Sure,
had
yeah.
a thought
I
on
guess in terms of your exciting future question, I would lean toward sort of an extrapolation of the kinds of things that Meredith had already mentioned, just in terms of reporting tools in particular, because there are too few reporters in the world, frankly, and anything to help surface stories that need to be told, I think would be a positive development.
Okay, thanks. Andreas, any thoughts on?
So as I said, I'm involved in this forecasting project for many, many years now. And what I would be really excited about is if this project, this automation project, actually leads to journalists. I mean, maybe I'm too idealistic, but so the problem that we have with our tool is we're very accurate in our predictions. They never change, which means that they are not newsworthy at all. So what happens actually when journalists cover elections, they pick the exciting poll, right? They pick the poll that is way out of range, that is an outlier. And by building these tools that we are building right now, we kind of, by attracting coverage, we kind of hope to focus people more on like evidence-based forecasting principles and accurate predictions and not as much on news value. That's what I would be really excited about.
So your exciting thing is to make everything a bit duller.
Excuse me?
Sorry, I was saying your exciting thing is to make everything a little bit less exciting. Or
yeah, I know.
More
I mean,
realistic.
I'm probably
That's
very,
okay,
very.
It's a noble aim for journalism.
Point.
I've had the signal. I just want to thank the panel. That was an absolutely fascinating discussion. 3 years ago, when I was last here, there was almost no discussion of automation of journalism at all. Like, it was a surprise for a lot of people that Twitter was a thing in the newsroom. And I'm sure that sort of, from here on, it will just become a more and more important part of what we talk about. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you to you for your patience and attention. Thanks very much.
Writing stories based upon data without any human intervention. So many people refer to this as robot journalism. When I say without human intervention, this means, of course, after the initial programming of the algorithm. Many people seem to forget that. So it's still a very human process. So everything the algorithm does has been predefined by humans. So which information goes in, how it's processed, and how it comes out. And then there's, of course, humans involved in maintaining the algorithms and refining them. But basically, the idea is that you have an algorithm, and once it's created, you can generate thousands of stories automatically on a particular topic. And I've written about this in the guide to automated journalism that Emily referred to. Can I have the slides? Thanks. And it's geared towards the target group of journalists, so it's an easy access to the topic. So I think it's a good starting point for you to jump off if you're interested in that topic. What I want you to get out of the 10 minutes is 4 things. I didn't know how much you know about this, so I kind of want to do some groundwork and explain the basic process of how this works. I want to briefly tell you the potentials and limitations of the technology, which then brings me to the conditions when it's actually useful, and I will then talk about why I think this will become more important. So how does it work? I want to explain this in very simple terms using an example from a project that we are currently working on where we develop automated news based on forecasting data for this year's presidential election. So this is a project called thepolyvote.com, which has been founded in 2004. I have been working on this in 2007. since 2007, and it's all about using evidence-based forecasting principles to predict elections. But if you want to tell a story about a forecast, let's say a poll, what you need to do is you need to collect data in the first place, and you need to collect it automatically. So the data needs to automatically feed into your system in order to trigger the generation of the text. And if you want to describe a poll, for example, of course you need polling data. So you need to know who conducted the poll, when it was conducted, who was surveyed, registered voters, likely voters, how many people were surveyed, what was the margin of error, and of course information on what's the actual preference of the people. Are they going to vote for Clinton or for Trump? When you have that kind of data, it's very easy to write a simple story about that poll. But maybe you want to make your story more interesting, and then for this you need to collect more data. So if, for example, if you have polling data over the course of the campaign, you could make comparisons of the polls, the recent polls to previous polls, let's say a month ago, a week ago, or whatever. You can add more data. You can have historical data on polls. Polls from previous elections, and you can
pleased that you're brave enough to come to a session called Can a Robot Do My Job? We'll be asking you what you do later, and the panel will be going, yes, it can, no, it can't. My name's Emily Bell. I'm the director of the Tower Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University in New York. And I'm really thrilled that we've got 4 fantastic exponents of what's being thought about and done at the cutting edge of automated journalism or artificial intelligence and journalism. And they're all going to, first of all, show you what they do, and then they'll be very happy to concretely answer the question, can a robot do your job? Starting right at the end, just a brief intro, starting right at the end of the row, we have Andreas Graef, who's actually a Tau Fellow, as are many of the others on the panel. I urge you to read Andreas's excellent Guide to Automated Journalism, which is a Tau Center publication. I will tweet the link to that later so that you
can have polls at the state level. And then you can make statements such as, I don't know, this is the largest lead of a Democratic candidate in the state of Florida in the April of an election year since 1996, when Clinton was running against Dole, for example. So the more data you have, the more possibilities and the more sophisticated your stories can become, but also the more complex it will be to actually define the algorithm. And this brings me to the second step, which is where it becomes rather challenging, where you actually define what you get out of the data. So you identify the interesting events. And this is very difficult. So for example, right now in the project, we're debating about, what's a momentum? Like, how would you describe whether a candidate has a momentum or not? It's very hard to come up with a specific rule based on data to identify that. You could say, for example, if a candidate gains support in the last 3 polls, but then again, this is one rule. Maybe it's not the right one. There's no expert consensus on that. Same for outlier poll. When is a poll an outlier? If it deviates from the polling average, yes, but by how much? And compared to the recent polling average or compared to the last week? So these are very difficult questions, and to keep people longer on their sites. And automation technology is valuable in doing that, in reaching new audiences. I've talked to this.
You can read it, which if you don't know what our panel are talking about, is a really fantastic primer. Next to Andreas, we have Justin Myers, who is the automation editor at the Associated Press. Next to Justin, we have Nick Diakopoulos, who is that rarest of things, a computational journalist. And Nick, also a Tau Fellow, is now at the University of Maryland, where you run. What's the name of your lab now, Nick? The Computational Journalism Lab. And then to my immediate right, another Tau Fellow who's doing some work for us at the moment on artificial intelligence and investigative reporting, but is also a colleague in the academic sense, in that she is an assistant professor at NYU, is Meredith Broussard. So as I say, what we're going to do is each of the panel are going to take a few minutes just to show you what they're working on and what they're thinking about. And then we will have a discussion prompted by that, and we'd like you all to be a very active part of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Andreas to kick us off, giving a sort of an overview of the field.
Oh yeah. So one area of my research is automated journalism. And I've heard people using this term over the past few days, meaning different things. What I mean is algorithms or software